Last week, we were talking about using extra biblical resources for biblical interpretation. I was trying to address the question of why Lazarus was in the tomb 4 days, and there's this extra biblical, more specifically rabbinical tradition that his soul would hang around the body for 3 days, and on the 4th day, once decomposition set in with the face, then they would leave. Now, I found that to be problematic, and if you want to know why, and you should probably watch the recording from last week. But I thought it was kind of problematic, and it seemed to kind of jump the gun because that tradition came about 150 years after John, or was first recorded. 150 years after John. So I thought trying to get a more biblical viewpoint to try and look in other places in the Bible, able to try and figure that out, seemed to be a better solution to try and fix some of the issues. But today, we're going to get back into the text proper, and we're going to look at Jesus comforting Martha. And depending on how fast we go through it, might also get to Mary as well. But I'm gonna imagine that we're only going to get to Martha because basically the quintessential saying of Christ in the Gospel of John is in this section. So I'm probably going to have a lot to say about it. I don't know. You might just tell me to move on, but I'm probably going to have a lot to say about it. Anyway, so we're going to be looking specifically at Mary. So this is going to be John chapter 11, verses 17 to 27. Somebody like to read?
Okay. Missed my turn last week. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been there, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is to come into the world.
All righty. So, a number of different things going on here. Already it's trying to frame this in terms of death, like the entire chapter tries to do this framing in terms of death and resurrection. But verse 17 is the first time tomb gets mentioned, and oddly enough, it's not really a common word. You might assume so with Christianity, just being all about the empty tomb, but it's not very common. It's only really mentioned with respect to Lazarus and to Jesus' own resurrection. So already it's kind of going like this is about death of the follower Jesus as well as Jesus himself. Then we're getting into more of the direction. So we're at Bethany near Jerusalem, as opposed to Bethany beyond the Jordan, where Jesus was when he received the message about Lazarus. So he's coming closer to Jerusalem. Since we're using an American translation, it says 2 miles, but me being a Canadian, I like to think of it more as 3 kilometers thereabouts. Different from the 15 stadia in the Greek. That's how long's a stadium?
Football stadium?
No, a Greek stadium. A unit of measure. So plural would be stadia. Okay. So pretty close to Jerusalem. Many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. What might this tell you about, well, the culture of the time, or even Lazarus himself? Many Jews came to Mary and Martha.
He was well respected.
Sure, let's go with respect. He was at least well known. And also, yeah, it depends. You could also maybe he was well respected. We don't have quite that, but you'd assume so, anyways. You can even go a little bit beyond that, because the Jews, and they're the ones who are hanging around with Mary and Martha. They're also seeing Jesus, so they're kind of through this whole chapter, as well as Mary and Martha. Mary and Martha are the ones who are named, but towards the end of the chapter, getting towards the end, after Lazarus is raised, verses 45-46, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him, but some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done.
They were spies.
Nope.
No?
Why would they be spies? What, they didn't know that Jesus was there. They came to Mary and Martha. Jesus wasn't there.
I know, but don't you think that they knew Jesus was friends and that chances are he'd come? I don't know.
He didn't come when Lazarus was sick. Why would he come? Why would Jesus come if Lazarus was dead?
I don't know.
Yeah, that's kind of Mary and Martha's complaint, is if you had been here, my brother would not have died. So yeah, why would there, if Jesus didn't come when he was sick, why would he come if he was dead? So what we can discern is that at least some of these Jews actually knew members of the Sanhedrin, the ruling religious body of Israel. So we could also infer that Lazarus might have had some direct or indirect connection to the Sanhedrin. Some commentators speculate that he was a member of the Sanhedrin, but we have no real evidence to make that type of conclusion. But he was connected to them in some way. So he was fairly well known, and he was at least moderately important. But we also know that it was common practice back in the day to get a company of mourners. So if somebody died, friends and family would come in and they would mourn alongside you. If you were wealthy enough, you get hangers on there just trying to show like, oh, I'm so dismayed over the loss in your family, very rich person. Oh, I'm so dismayed. And on occasion, some rich people would even hire mourners to mourn outside their home.
Don't Jews still have a week or so of mourning like that? Don't the Jewish still do that, the Jewish faith? Gather for their, I forgot what they call it now, what's the word for it? For a week, I think they,
Yeah.
that mourning period. And they gather.
At least some of them do. I don't know if all the sects of Judaism do that, but at least some of them do.
I get my information from the movies.
Yes. Yeah, unfortunately, like I haven't done deep dives into Jewish theology, especially contemporary Jewish theology, because as you can imagine, that since Christianity is complex enough in its beliefs with a whole bunch of different denominations, like there's no exception with any religion that survived to the modern day. Like there's so many different types of, well, not a ton of different types of Judaism. There's a decent number, but there's a lot of different types of Judaism. There's tons of different types of Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure about the different sects in Judaism, if all of them still do that. I would imagine the Orthodox still do.
Yeah. The Orthodox call it sitting Shiva.
Shiva, that's the word.
Sure. Jewish pronunciations change. Sorry, what did you guys say?
It could be linked to that allegation that soul takes 4 days to go away, so
Oh.
they sit with the person while the soul is still present in some way, so. Maybe not.
Well, I don't know if that kind of made it in there over the years. I would say it probably wouldn't be around this time, because then people would only be mourning for, say, like, a full 3 days, maybe part of the fourth, and then, but since it's more like a week of mourning, yeah, they would be kind of be premature to do that. I don't know if it moved in later on, though. It could have moved in later on. I don't keep with rabbinical traditions because there's so many different rabbis, and they're all. That's why you have the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the rabbinical commentaries on the Old Testament, and then you have the Talmud, which is the commentaries on the Mishnah on the Old Testament, and then with even modern day Judaism, you have every other rabbi commenting on the comments on ritual source. So it doesn't necessarily go all the way to the source sometimes. Anyways, so yeah, standard practice for that. Jews. I think I covered it. Oh, it's also curious that John calls them Jews. Why would you assume so? Or how does John use the word Jews throughout the rest of his gospel?
What else would he call them?
Well, he's calling the Pharisees the Jews.
Sorry, what was that, April?
I said, isn't he usually calling the Pharisees the Jews? The Pharisees and the Sadducees and those people.
Usually John's a bit more specific on the Pharisees. It's usually when he means Pharisees, he means Pharisees. But you're on the right track. Where Jews, like the title, is often associated with Pharisees. It's where the Jews come, then they start saying, oh, then we'll bring up the Pharisees, or we'll tell the Pharisees, or something of the sort. But basically, John usually uses the term Jews in a more derogatory sense, because they're usually the ones who are in unbelief.
Oh.
So when Jesus is being harassed by the Jews, John is using the term Jews to refer not to anybody of a specific ethnicity per se, but people who are not in line with Jesus. So John, I haven't seen an instance of it. It might still be in there. I haven't seen an instance of it, but John doesn't seem to use the term Jew to refer to any of the disciples.
Oh,
Jesus ever. Like I have not noticed this. Like there might be a reference there somewhere, but I haven't seen it or noticed it. I mean, because yeah, even with say bread of life discourse, and the Jews keep trying to follow Jesus around, and then Jesus finally has speech to the Jews, and then Jesus gives the speech to the Jews, and the Jews go, "Oh, this is a hard saying," and then they start to leave, and then John says, and then Jesus turned to his disciples. Kind of just differentiating between well, not even just the disciples, but the followers of Jesus, and then some of the followers of Jesus leave, and then Jesus turns specifically to the disciples. So John is making a division between the followers of Jesus and Jews. So presumably, this crowd is also a crowd of unbelievers at this time.
unbelievers in the Messiah and in Christ.
Well,
They're,
in Jesus specifically, they're
Yeah.
believers in the Messiah,
but not that
they
one.
be convinced that the Messiah is Jesus. See, that's why Martha's statement in verse 27 is important, because she's saying he is the Messiah, he is the Christ, the Son of God who's come into the world.
At
All
that
believe in the
point,
Messiah, they just don't associate with Jesus.
so when she said in verse 27, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world. Do you think that she even had an inkling about what Jesus was about to do?
No.
We're going to get to that.
Okay, right.
Well, it's kind of the thing that also leads into the next little bit there. We have to cover Jesus' important statement even before we get to that. So, but the person of Martha, that we have to consider as well. Then who is Martha?
She was,
Where was it? Okay. Well, we find Mary and Martha come up earlier in time with Luke chapter 10. And this is the only other instance where they're really mentioned. Because they come up in the Gospel of John, and they're important for a chapter and a bit. Because we have John chapter 11, and then Jesus is in Lazarus' home to be anointed by Mary, which is what John really wants to focus on, is the anointing. But if we're looking for any other background for Mary and Martha, we have to go to Luke chapter 10, the end of the chapter. This is the only other time that they really come up. And if I have my timeline correct, I'm assuming that this is in between the celebration of tabernacles, which is John chapters 7 to 10 and a half, and Hanukkah, where Jesus is at the temple again, which is the last half of chapter 10. I'm assuming that this is in between those two instances, but I could be wrong on that. I could be wrong. But this would have happened probably a couple of months or more before the events that we're going through in John chapter 11. So it says here in Luke chapter 10, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things. But, few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. I haven't read the NIV of this passage for a while. That's an interesting translation.
What chapter are you reading?
Chapter 10 in Luke.
Oh, in Luke.
No, yeah, this isn't going on in John.
Looking for it.
And John.
No, that's not done. So Luke chapter 10. We do see some similarities between the actions of Mary and Martha here in Luke chapter 10 and John chapter 11. So in John chapter 11, it was made known that Jesus was coming into the town. Jesus had not yet entered the village of Bethany, but Jesus was coming to town, and it was made known. Martha got up and she went out of her home to go meet Jesus on the road. And that's characteristic here in Luke chapter 10 and in John chapter 11. So Martha is being the, if you will, type A personality, the one that's going out and doing something. And sometimes people use the terms extroverted, introverted, but that's harder to make the case for that because we also don't have the psychology of Mary and Martha, because extroversion and introversion deal with how you perceive and interact with information in the world, Extroversion is you're kind of going out into the world a bit more. So your thought world is towards the exterior, whereas an introvert, your thought world is more interior. Extroverts tend to be more person oriented, so you're trying to deal more with people and go into larger groups. Introversion deals more with self and reflection of the self. So it's harder to make those types of judgments with Mary and Martha, but you can do something even more generic, type A, type B personalities, where Martha is the more active one, going out and trying to get things done. Martha is a little bit more contemplative and willing to listen to Jesus and be in his presence.
It sounds like the house was Martha's house. So it kind of makes sense that she's doing all this stuff. And
No,
maybe
it's
Mary maybe was a guest, do you think?
No,
That
no,
day?
that's not how houses worked back then.
What?
That's not how houses worked back then.
Oh, okay.
We also know specifically that it's Mary, Martha's, and Lazarus's house.
Oh,
So a house in modern day and age, or contemporary day and age, not even just modern, but contemporary, generally it is just the nuclear family. So mother, father, children. Now that society is moving away from the nuclear family, you might have less people in there, but still nuclear family. Historically, this is not the case. Even if we're going to the early modern period, it would not have been the case. But generally, before the rise of old age homes, among other things, you'd have a multi-generational household. So you'd have the grandparents, the parents, and the kids. And going even further back in history, where you don't necessarily want to make a whole bunch of different households, it would be grandparents, multiple families of the sons, so the sons and their wives, and then their kids, all in one house. So these houses tend to be a lot bigger. This would also be one of the reasons why, when Joseph and Mary went to the house, and the actual word in Luke is a house or a large house, Luke tends to be very specific with his words. Sometimes people translate that as inn. That's not really a good way to translate that, because this is before inns were really a thing. But the big house, Matthew also says house. There would be no room in there, because if you have a whole bunch of different family members coming and living in one place for the census, there's going to be no room in there. So odds are they have to be in the stable part of the house. Joseph and Mary would most likely be in there with the animals instead of with the people, which is also not terribly different from how sometimes people would interact with their animals, because sometimes during winter you would actually bring them into the house so they don't freeze to death.
That'd be fun.
Yep. So yeah, being in the stable is not the stable portion of the house is not too different. But yeah, if you understand it as multi-generational, multi-familial, multi-nuclear family household, it makes sense.
so when the
Mary and
Magi,
Martha at this time were probably not married, which is why they're probably still living with their brother Lazarus. If they
so,
had their own husbands, they would be living in their husbands' homes.
so they were probably younger than Lazarus?
Yep.
And with no mention of Lazarus having a wife doesn't mean he did or didn't have one.
He most likely did. It would be extremely unusual for somebody not to have a spouse, because that was what was expected of you. You grew up, you got married. The only reason Lazarus might not have a wife would be if she died earlier on and he had not been remarried.
Okay.
Yeah. But Mary and Martha, since they would have been in the in the houses of their husbands, because you would go to the husband's house because you married into that family. They were most likely not married. Especially when you consider them to be sisters, because if you go to the husband's house, so say that Lazarus had two brothers, and then the brothers, their wives were Mary and Martha, then it would be extremely unusual for Martha and Mary to be sisters in that household. They would just be the two different sisters-in-law. But it says that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were all siblings. Therefore, Mary and Martha were probably not married. So it could be that they're relatively young. Logic. Okay, so the point I want to make, flipping over to Luke chapter 10, is the basic behaviors of Mary and Martha in this section are going to be very similar to what's going on in John chapter 11. Martha is the one who's going to go out. She's going to be the one who's very interested in solving problems. Mary is going to be a bit more reserved and going to be focused more on Jesus as a person. So, depending on how you want to interpret it, you could also say maybe Mary's a bit more of the extrovert because she's focused on a particular individual and trying to figure that person out. Or Martha is more of the introvert because she's not interested as much with the people as she is with the problem. But that's also kind of pop psychology, because I'm not getting into the different personality types and the differences between them and blah, 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 blah. Anyways, Martha is trying to reason through things. Mary is trying to feel through things, especially with other people. So Mary is also staying behind in the home with all the other mourners. Some of the ancient commentators, and I mean like the historical church fathers, some of them are saying, oh, well, Mary probably didn't hear that Jesus was coming to town, that's why she stayed. I don't know about that. It really depends on how you translate a conjunction here. The but there. Let's see. A second. Sorry, that's first John. Yeah, Mary stayed home. Yeah, it really depends on how you want to translate that word, to say if it's contrasting Mary with Martha, because if it's Martha heard that Jesus was coming and Mary stayed home, maybe Martha only heard it, but if it's but or however or something like that, then Mary is in contrast to Martha, where she's kind of aware but not doing it. But now I'm going into the weeds. Okay.
So he had Mary Magdalene too as a friend.
Yeah, she is a disciple of Jesus. She does not appear in the Gospel of John until the crucifixion, I believe.
But it wouldn't be this Mary.
Not this Mary, no. They're always viewed as different individuals. Because if we're going back to Luke, actually I need to flip around in Luke just to make sure that I can see this. Mary Magdalene comes up. Actually, I know it's in here somewhere. I'm pretty sure she comes up earlier.
Was that the one that he drove out some devils or something out of Mary Magdalene?
Well, we don't actually have a depiction of that happening. Luke is the one who mentions her coming up. I'm not entirely sure why I can't see this. Ah, here it is. Because Mary Magdalene comes up basically as a footnote in Luke chapter 8, verse 2. Because Luke says the 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary, called Magdalene, so she was from the town of Magdalena, from whom 7 demons had come out. And that's all we have for the background of Mary Magdalene. So Magdalene is actually not a last name per se.
This is from.
Yeah, it's from where she's from. Now, eventually you get last names where your last names are where you're from. But so she's from Magdalena, which is a very different place than Bethany. So there's very little reason to say that they're the same one. The issue comes in a little bit earlier in Luke chapter 7, where a sinful woman comes to anoint Jesus. So he's in the Pharisee's house, a sinful woman, and that's all we're told, so we don't know if she's actually a prostitute, this sinful woman. But she comes in, anoints Jesus' feet, wipes his feet with her tears. And Jesus forgives her her sins. Sometimes people assume that this is Mary Magdalene, because Mary Magdalene's mentioned right at the beginning of the next chapter, but Luke doesn't mention any prostitution on Mary's behalf, so it's kind of odd that you would associate Mary with a supposed prostitute here. However, that just kind of made its way into the traditions over time. So Mary Magdalene's not. We have no reason to believe that she's actually a prostitute, even though in the Catholic Church she's the saint of prostitutes. Because they have that. Oh, so is Saint Nicholas, by the way, Santa Claus. Yeah, that's because Saint Nick's gift, the original gift giving that he actually did, was throwing some money into young women's house because they were in poverty and they were about to sell themselves into prostitution. So Saint Nick gave them a monetary gift so that they wouldn't have to sell themselves into prostitution. So that's where the gift giving at Christmas comes from. That's also why Saint Nick is the patron saint of prostitutes.
My goodness.
Yes. I didn't think I'd be talking about that this morning. The more you know, the more you know.
Kids used to go to Victorians.
But anyway, yeah, so this woman, since she anointed Jesus, usually, or sometimes she's associated with Mary, the sister of Lazarus, because Mary also anoints Jesus. But I would say that since that occurs well before this period of time, it's very hard to try and make the connection that that Mary and that prostitute's the same. Because the events going on here in John chapter 11 is shortly before Jesus Christ's death and crucifixion, whereas Luke chapter 7 is occurring during the Galilean ministry of Jesus, about you could argue about a year or more away from the crucifixion. So two different events.
Well, I have no concept of the distance between the two Marys, but it just seemed like this Mary would be at Jesus' grave, but it's Mary Magdalene, but it's not the same Mary.
Well,
Well,
it's hard to say. She might have been at the grave too. Mary and Martha might have been at the grave, but usually when you get into the descriptions of who's coming, the gospel writers, being first century writers, like for 21st century writers, we want to be as detailed as possible. That is not the case of many historical writers. They want to focus on the particular details that are relevant to what they want to push forward. So for John, the only woman that he mentions coming to Jesus Christ's tomb, for example, is Mary Magdalene. He doesn't really name anybody else. because Mary Magdalene's the one he wants to focus on. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, some of them will mention a couple of the women in common, but I can't remember who it is, but I know one of them mentions more women by name than the others. One of them, I think, only says this woman and this woman were at the tomb. And that doesn't mention the other women. Whereas another one will say this woman were at the tomb along with others. So we actually don't know how many women went to the tomb. And it could have actually included Mary and Martha, we don't know.
So
Or
Jesus,
even with the crucifixion as well. Yeah.
Jesus drove demons out of Mary Magdalene.
Yeah. Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah. Anyway, so there's a lot of women named Mary in the Bible. We'll say that. Oddly enough, or sadly enough, I guess you could even say, historical scholars, they actually try to demonstrate that this was not an issue, because there are historical records of women's names on tombs from this era. So there's actually surveys done about all the tombs and charnel boxes and what else in this area of Palestine within the first couple centuries BC, first couple centuries AD, and they put down all the names to try and get a type of frequency for how often these names come up. So Mary and Martha are the two most popular names around this time for women. So it's understandable that you have several different Marys going around at the same time.
Yeah, a lot of Mary.
Well, that's the same true today.
You're going to make up a story. You're going to make up a story. Also, you're going to name a whole bunch of different people, well, a whole bunch of different names. If you want to tell a true story, you're just going to give everybody the same, like the names that they come with. So you're not going to mess with the names. So odds are, if this was a fake story, you'd have a lot more variation in the names. But there's so many different Johns, the Jameses, Marys, because those were fairly popular. There's a few different Jesuses, because those are popular names. Okay. Went into a little bit of that. Okay. So Martha's statement. Lord. Odds are she's using the name Lord, not to call Jesus the divine Lord Yahweh of the Old Testament. She's most likely just using the polite form of the dress. This is her going to be called, it would be the equivalent of calling him sir or even teacher. So yeah, she's not making a divine statement right here. But she says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Very concise statement. And
Why didn't she just say, how come you let my brother die? Because he didn't have to be there.
well, it's also, well, I don't think many people are going to go up to somebody and go, sir, you suck. Because the two things seem to not work well. So she's going to be a bit more polite. But she's also expressing her grief. So she is actually being open with this. So she wants to be respectful, but she's also going to point out, I believe that you could have raised or healed my brother. If you had been here, he would not have happened. So this is the reason why Mary and Martha at the beginning of the chapter send a messenger to Jesus so that he would come here to heal Lazarus. So she is terribly disappointed.
But look
However,
at verse.
Oh, sorry.
Look at verse 22. She says,
yeah.
but I
Yeah.
know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Wow.
Yeah. However, she does have some sort of hope in Jesus. She does know something will happen. So she says, but I know that even now God will give whatever you ask. And she is expressing hope in a future resurrection. So that's what she's saying in verse 24, where she says, I know he will rise again at the last day. So odds are she's not thinking that Jesus is going to raise her brother from the dead. What is she thinking that Jesus will actually ask God, or the Father more specifically? Don't exactly know, but my guess would be that she wants Jesus to pray to the Father on behalf of Lazarus, so that God would look favorably upon Lazarus. And right now, because I'm speaking to Lutherans, I have to make a very big distinction. So we're not praying to the dead, we're praying for the dead. And you find this like in the Bible, you also find this in different Lutheran services. So yeah, we pray to God for the souls of the deceased, that God would look after them. But what ends up happening for Lutherans, which doesn't end up happening for Roman Catholics, is we stop. Because if we commend somebody to God's care in death, we've done all that we can do. Like, they're in God's hands now, that you can't really do anymore. They can't really do anymore. They're away from earthly works that they're part of. The veil is somewhat revealed now, so they know who's in charge and everything. So if there was such a thing to do with faith, then there you go. But we basically, our prayers for the dead are to commend them to God, but certain denominations of Christianity, they don't stop praying because they believe you can still do something for them even after death. So Roman Catholics might interpret this verse as, aha, see, Martha is asking Jesus to pray for Lazarus in purgatory, that Lazarus gets feeded through purgatory. And Lutherans would not say that, because everything's pretty much decided now. So anyway, so odds are Martha's asking for Jesus to commend her deceased brother to the Father. Questions, concerns? The Lutherans are right with us. Okay.
Well, that verse 22 made me think that maybe she had this hope that maybe he could be raised right now. I don't know.
Nope, because she contradicts that right there he will rise again at the last day.
Oh, okay.
So that's what she has in mind. So
Oh, I see. Okay.
yeah. So she's not really thinking about this. This is why Jesus has to correct her thought.
Well, I can understand her frustration, because apparently Jesus did wait for 2 days after he heard Lazarus was sick. So there was a time lag there.
Yeah. So understandably, she's frustrated. And that's kind of the thing that I'm not a big fan of in commentaries, because a lot of the commentaries, they approach this from a very theological, analytical viewpoint, and they don't understand that Jesus is also trying to be very pastoral here. So Jesus is not going to rebuke her for her lack of belief, if you will. Because even when Jesus says, like he says to her, your brother will rise again, and then she misunderstands, he will rise again in the last day. Jesus isn't rebuking her, saying, why would you just assume that it's going to happen the last day? Don't you know that I'm the resurrection? No. Because he's trying to be understanding of the emotional state of Mary and Martha. So Martha trying to figure out the issue. And yeah, we're going to see very big differences between how Jesus interacts with Martha and Mary. But since Martha's trying to work through the grief by trying to like, well, it's too late to save my brother from death, but I know now God will still give you whatever you ask. So she's still trying to solve the problem as best as can be solved at this point in time. And Jesus is trying to point her to the actual hope. So not just comfort in the here and now, but Jesus saying, well, no, your brother will rise again. Okay. Where'd it go? Where did this? Ah, yes, that's also one of the points that I wanted to point out. Okay. So what is Jesus actually directing her to? That is a big question. So somebody has just died. What words does Jesus use to comfort her?
He reminds her that he is the resurrection and the life.
Well, specifically, why is he doing it? Like, he's saying, what is he saying?
He just says he will rise again, didn't say when.
Yeah. If somebody's mourning, like if somebody is mourning the loss of someone, and Linda's not in the room because that would also be kind of the go-to, I imagine. But what do you normally say to somebody, like somebody that you know who just lost someone?
I'm sorry for your.
Sorry for your loss.
Sorry for the loss.
Mhm. And if they're Christian, you would say, we will meet again.
Mhm. Yeah. So often enough we don't follow Jesus to the letter here, where we don't necessarily point to the concrete hope of the resurrection. Is that we usually go, yeah, this is very hard. Well, so that does have its place. It depends on where the person's at, because that's more the approach that Jesus has with Mary, because you can see that. So when Mary has a very similar word to Jesus, Jesus kind of just emoted with her, if you will.
He
So
what?
he was deeply moved and he wept. So he emoted. And that tends to be more what we do when we say, like, yeah, I'm sorry for your loss. But if we're talking about loss, well, there's also the hope of gain in the resurrection to come. But one of the things that people tend to focus on, which they shouldn't focus on as much because Jesus doesn't mention this at all here, is they're in a better place now.
You don't want to hear about.
Nah.
I think having experienced loss, you don't have to say anything. I think it's your presence that's the comfort.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think we always think we should have something profound to say, but whatever we say really doesn't matter at that moment.
Yeah.
Because they're so encompassed in their own grief.
Like skipping ahead to Mary now. But yeah, being present with somebody is absolutely essential for anybody dealing with grief, loss of loved ones, or any other loss that you experience in life. So that's also the importance of Jesus, kind of coming to Martha and Mary, is for him to be present. Now, his presence, of course, gives also the hope of resurrection and life, but being present and actually talking with them, because Jesus didn't immediately just walk over to Lazarus's tomb, raise Lazarus, and then just walk into their house with Lazarus. No, he first wanted to deal with their situation where they're at right then and there. He didn't just try to fix the issue, you tried to understand them and be present with them. Yeah, the better place now doesn't really work. I advise you to stay away from that from a biblical perspective, because even when we're looking at depictions of those who have died, and John gives this window into this in the book of Revelation. So in Revelation chapter 6, there are the martyrs of the faith who are under the altar in heaven. Basically, they're all calling it out for the final judgment to occur, because they're asking the Lord, how long until our blood is avenged upon the earth? So they're very much looking forward to the final judgment, where you also have the general resurrection to come. This is what they're hoping for. And even with the saints around the throne in heaven in Revelation chapter 7, when John talks to the elder next to the throne, the elder is professing that, yes, these are all the saints that are coming out of the great tribulation, that are around the throne, but they're hoping to be led by the Lamb, Jesus, to the final paradise, to where the hardships of the earth won't follow them, where the tears will be wiped from their eyes, where they'll be joined with living water. So it's always paradise. Yeah.
How do you asked us what we say when we approach somebody. What do you say when you approach somebody that's just lost someone?
Ooh, what do I say? Usually I start with a question, which is, and I usually ask more, how are you doing or how are you feeling? Because I could care less about how I'm feeling at that particular time, because I know what I'm feeling, I know what I'm doing. But usually what I try to do is I try to let the person express their own grief. Because one of the issues, or the psychological issues with grief, not just with loss of an individual, but with loss of anything, is that you tend to have an internal dialogue that's all internalized. And with grief being the big ball of messy emotions that keeps shifting around, you just go over the same things over again and again and again, and you're not necessarily processing this in the best way. So what I like to do is I like to invite the person to share with me what they're thinking, what they're feeling. And I leave it as a very open-ended question so they can tell me anything. And then they just tell me. So that externalizes the internal thoughts, so then they don't necessarily have to work through that again and again and again. They can actually just have it out there. So that's usually what I like to do, is I don't care what I say. I want to hear what they say. And then once I have an idea of exactly their thoughts on the matter, then I try to address those particular thoughts.
People are individually different.
Yes.
Too. I mean, it depends on the person that's passed away and the situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, and what relationship they were to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you could have people who have grieved a lot already, because if it's expected death over a long period of time, then the person has a lot to process already, so then they can tell you about that. So they might not have a lot to grieve in the sense of loss, because they already grieved the loss, but they could actually be grieving not the loss of the person, but the loss of purpose, because they spent a lot of time interacting with that person on the way to their death. And now that that's gone, well, now they have a whole bunch more free time, and a whole bunch more free time that they have no idea how to fill, and now will be filled with the thoughts of, I've lost this person. So you also want to address that particular form of loss, but yeah, if it's a sudden death, well, then this is also a very different type of loss. And they'll just be going through a lot of memories of that individual, and they don't know how to connect the life with individual with the life without that individual. Like the everyday interaction. So you can see the similarities between the two, but it's like it manifests in very different ways.
It's different. My husband passed away just suddenly enough. we were all packed, ready to go down to Seattle that morning, and he was fine. And
That
then
must have been very hard.
he went, so it's a shock. It's hard to understand sometimes why that happens like that. And then you feel, oh, I didn't have a chance even to
Yeah.
say goodbye, you know. And that-
Right. Yeah.
But I think it doesn't matter which way it goes, it's hard on. I remember somebody once told me that she was told that she should stop grieving, and I said, you know, you never stop grieving. I don't know what you do, but sometimes you still feel that way, don't you?
Yeah,
see?
you never get over the loss.
No.
You live with it.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I mean, you don't sit there and weep about it continually, but I mean, it does it. You grieve off and on, always from the loss.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And my husband was only 66 when he passed away, so.
Yeah, that's not terribly old at all.
Oh,
Yeah, it's how I tend to think of it is, since you with anybody, as you go through life, you're actually sharing your life with them. So when you lose that particular person, whether in death or maybe they're moved or something else, like those would be like the smaller forms of loss where you're losing certain forms of interaction with them, but death is the big one. Yeah, you're now losing a big chunk of life that you had. So if you're still the same individual you were before, and you are, you have to grieve the loss of your life with that person. So your own life is compromised. So yeah, I don't imagine that you really get over it. Like you learn to live with
Yeah,
it.
you live with it.
But yeah, it's still a part of you because you spent life with that person.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and even when you were just talking about that, you were expressing a couple of different emotions because there was well, the sense of loss in it, and you were also talking a little bit about guilt, not saying exactly what you wanted to say, right? Because it was so sudden. But yeah, that's also what people do in grief, is that you have this weird ball of emotions, and sometimes you feel one of them, then you go to the next, and then you go to the next, and
I'm thinking
Yeah.
also of Sophie, you know, with her mom,
yeah,
you know, I mean, she said, you know, she's gonna miss her, or she misses her, but she knows that her mom didn't have any, you know, her life was kind of not too good anymore. And that's so, it
Yeah.
was a blessing for her in a lot of ways. So the grieving is different there again. You know,
yeah.
you grieve it and yet you're happy that she's in a better place.
Mhm.
But,
Yeah.
I mean, I
one of
would
the,
say that to her, I would still say,
Well, yeah.
I would still say, I'm sorry to hear you lost, but
Well, no. Yeah, because we have our own
But they're all
particular
different.
opinions about that,
Yeah.
but yeah, for that person who's more involved with a particular individual, like, we don't necessarily want to have our feelings projected onto the other person. Yeah.
one of the things that I found when I lost my parents was later on, after you're not grieving so much because you're comfortable knowing they're in Lord's hands, but
Mhm,
you
mhm.
might want to, oh gee, I wish they were here so I could ask them this question
oh,
that
Yeah.
they would know the answer to.
Oh, yeah.
I still do that sometimes, like, oh, I should tell Wally that. Do
Yeah, right.
Oh, yeah. Well,
you do that, Nancy? Do you ever think,
Yeah, particularly
when something happens?
if it's something that was important to him.
Yeah.
Yeah,
mhm, mhm.
Think, oh, I should tell.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, and this is a smaller loss than yours, but when I lost, I think both cats, but especially the last cat that I had, like walk into the room and then you expect the person to be right there and you're like, no. And so, like I also, a few times I was wandering around, like trying to look for him, like, oh, no, wait, he's not here. But, no,
Yeah.
and that's also something that you could discuss.
Yeah.
Mhm.
My sister that was here in the fall, they had a 3-year-old son that got behind the father's tractor on the farm and was run over and killed.
Mm.
Oh,
And that kind of a loss, I think.
Oh, my.
My sister said she had the loss, but he had the guilt. Her husband had the guilt to go along with the loss.
Yeah.
And I think those kind of
Oh, that would be
Mhm,
just terrible.
mhm.
losses are
Oh,
more difficult to get over.
I'm sure.
Oh,
You
yeah.
probably never get over that.
No.
And this is also why having, well, you could say a Christian counselor is useful because they can help draw out those feelings, but far more important is, this is why it's so important to have Christ there. Because if you feel guilty about anything in regards to that person, not only do you have the promise of forgiveness in Jesus Christ, so you can pray to Christ to try and remove this guilt from you. Like you're still gonna feel that, yeah, I'm responsible in some way. But you know that you're not guilty of this anymore. Christ has wiped away that sin. But then you also have the hope in Christ of the resurrection that, yeah, I didn't tell this person I was sorry in person, but through Christ, I will see them again. And I can actually tell them everything that's been on my heart. So, yeah, it's kind of in a very concrete sense, we see this with Martha and Mary, where they're going to Jesus and they're talking about, Lord, if you had been here, then not died. Jesus points them to the actual resurrection, and then they go, that's off in the future. But when Christ actually raises Lazarus from the dead, they have Lazarus. They can talk to him now. They can interact with him. They can express the sorrows over him going. And they can really address the situation where it's like, yeah, you were gone, but this is how I felt, and I want to live with you in a way that's far more meaningful, while knowing that, yeah, the loss could have happened. So I don't know how we would really interact with our loved ones in the resurrection if we go into reflecting on what we didn't do, like the feelings not necessarily sinful, but still kind of some sort of guilt. I don't know how we'd interact with them, but we can actually kind of move forward.
I don't think we'd be doing that.
I don't know. I know, yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about, like, what would we be telling everybody when we see them again? I don't know.
Well, you know what? Doesn't there a passage in the Bible that says that we won't remember anything here?
Yeah.
Nope, not that. We
No, we'll be
remember
starting
stuff.
brand new.
And we remember stuff, otherwise this entire life is kind of pointless.
If we remembered the bad things that happened here, we wouldn't be so happy, would we?
Or we remember that Christ has triumphed over these things for us, and that we join in that triumph in that resurrection.
But there is a passage that indicated that we won't, this, nothing will come to mind.
I'm going to guess that
Yeah.
sins are not coming to mind. But like the remembrance of sin is not coming to mind, but no, we do have our memories. Because even if we look to the quintessential person who has resurrected, Jesus Christ, then he still remembered all the disciples. It's not like he forgot.
Oh, he's God, though.
Well, and even in Christ's flesh, he had the spear wound and the nail marks. So we also don't know if our bodies will bear some of the scars. Because there are actually theologians who believe, and I'm not necessarily sold on the idea, but there are some theologians who believe that we'll retain some of the scars that we've had in this life so that we can actually see how we healed from them. Similar to how Jesus triumphed over his mortal wounds.
I don't think so. From what I understand, we're going to be perfect.
Yeah, but it's still the same body that was laid to rest, so we don't know exactly what iteration of our body we're going to have. Is this going to be the prime of life scenario, or is this going to be a body very similar to the one that we died with right before then?
It'll be fun to find out.
Is this when we're going to be in the 40s, or do we get some sort of choice? What if I preferred having a little bit of gray in there? I don't know. So these are questions that we can ask, and we won't really receive an answer this side of the grave. But yeah, we can try to look to Christ as best as we can, because he is the one who's showing us in a perfect resurrected body, this is what we have.
I wonder if Lazarus is happy to be raised.
That's exactly what I was thinking. I wonder. No one knows.
I keep thinking of my dad.
Why?
Perfect body he's gonna have.
He might have said, "What'd you bring me back for?"
No, I think he got talked to before that happened.
So moving along.
Yeah. Finally,
Moving along. Jesus is comforting Martha, but with a very concrete hope of the resurrection. So it's not kind of the nebulous, oh, in a better place now, like we don't know exactly what's going on. And the visions that we do have of heaven are the people who are awaiting the actual resurrection and coming into paradise. So the true hope that we have is not joining the court ethereal up in heaven and singing praises into God before the resurrection, but the actual resurrection on the last day. You might notice also in my preaching at funerals, this is more what I preach, is the actual resurrection, coming into paradise. I'm not trying to comfort anybody with they're in a better place now, because yeah, it's a fairly nebulous thing. So we're going to see them again in the body, in the flesh. So, but Martha, taking Jesus' words of the resurrection, she's going in a kind of a different direction, where she's just kind of putting this off to the last day. So when I say on the last day, I'm pointing to the assured promise that Jesus Christ gave to us, but it's far more concrete than even a real historical event that is about to occur. So Jesus is trying to point her to himself. Martha is kind of pointing off to the future. So Martha is taking this idea from the Old Testament. And we do find this in the Old Testament in a couple of different prophets. The most well known and most visible will be Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. And
No, Job. Job?
Daniel.
No, I know, but also Job, right?
Sort of. Because Job was expressing a hope, but to actually get to how we understand the resurrection and the particular, like the general resurrection as well. So not just a resurrection of the faithful, but the resurrection of everybody. Daniel chapter 12 is where we get that. Job is actually expressing a very personal resurrection in order to maintain justice. So Job, when he's talking about this, he's saying, I know my Redeemer lives, my legal defendant, the one who will purchase me back from my enemies, because the Redeemer, the Goel, in the Hebrew culture, they were supposed to be the kinsman redeemer who buys you back from slavery or buys back your property from slavery, so they redeem you. So Job is saying, well, this Redeemer, in order to establish me before God, has to redeem me from death, has to buy me back from death, that I may actually talk to God face to face and have his courtroom setting, because a lot of Job is kind of in the motif of the courtroom. So Job is talking about a very personalized resurrection. And he does so also in, because that I know my Redeemer lives is in chapter 19. Chapter 14, Job also talks about that hiding in Sheol and then God remembering him. But for the more generalized resurrection, we go to Daniel chapter 12. And there, we have the prophet saying, well, there's going to be a resurrection of all people, some to everlasting life, some to everlasting damnation. This is also the resurrection as Jesus Christ describes it back in John chapter 5. So I'm imagining that that this is again what Martha has in mind. Even if she's been listening to Jesus, that this is probably what she has in mind in the general resurrection. Because those in Christ will be raised first, but everybody else will be brought before God and judged. So Martha most likely has in mind chapter 12, including on the last day, because Job is not giving any time frame for his resurrection. He's not purporting a last day. The idea of the last day is more, well, I guess you could say Daniel, but I would say a bit more Isaiah. Isaiah tends to use that type of terminology. On this day, this will happen. But yeah, in the New Testament, it's the last day. Actually, the phrase "the last day" it only comes up here once in the New Testament. This particular verse, but similar phrases as the last time or the last hour that appears in 1 Peter and Jude and 1 John. Looking at my notes. But last days also occurs in a number of different locations, but those are looking at everything from Jesus' resurrection forward. The last day is kind of just at the end.
I have a different interpretation. I'm sorry.
Yep.
What is that? How does that read in your Bible?
So in the NIV it says, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day."
He will rise. Okay, mine says, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world."
That's verse 27. I'm talking about verse 24.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, well, mine's the same.
There we go.
Yeah, I'm
There we
sorry.
go.
No, I was troubled by that.
I would be kind of puzzled because the very literal translation is last day. I'd be very, very surprised the ESV would say something different.
No, I was puzzled by the last verse here
Yeah,
in my Bible.
yeah. So Martha puts that in a very far off time, that this is actually going to be resolved. And this tends to be what I would say more in a funeral, is that I would put it off to the very concrete time that Jesus Christ gives to us. But I'm also preaching the hope of the resurrection in Christ. So usually I'd say a funeral, I would say that they did come to life in Jesus Christ, and they did receive this through the word and through baptism, and if they're confirmed through the Lord's Supper. So we know through these very objective, concrete things, this person received the life of Christ and is living in Christ. So though they die, yet shall they live. And we'll see this concretely in the resurrection come, but they're already alive in Christ awaiting that. And that's usually bare bones. The message that I have for a funeral sermon is to preach Christ, that he is the resurrection, that he has brought us to life, and then this will be brought about fully on the last day. Imitating Christ is the safest bet you have. In anything that you do. Right, before we get to,
Before.
oh, yeah, and before that too. Before we get to Jesus Christ's big statement, which doesn't look like we have time for. But before Jesus Christ's big statement, Martha is actually putting this on. So she's saying on the last day. And I think that this really reflects our situation as Christians, is that we know that this is going to happen, but we have no idea when. And we have to wait an undisclosed amount of time until it occurs. So, as you mentioned, you're living with the loss, you're living with the grief, and you have no idea when this is actually going to end. So it's yeah, I think it's a very heartbreaking thing to do when you have to live with it for who knows how long.
But we have lots to be thankful for.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, life is still wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
I always say at the time that God bless me, I had 15 grandkids. That kept me busy.
Mm.
When my mother was in the care home and she'd had a stroke, and she always was so busy before she had her stroke, I think she felt almost guilty of having people wait on her. But one of the things that I reminded her was that she has more time to pray, you know, and she did. She didn't know why. No one knows why or what day God's going to call you, right? But we're supposed to do whatever we can to serve the Lord in whatever capacity we're able, right?
Mm-hmm.
So getting back to that last verse, where she says, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who's coming into the world, is coming. So is she talking about the last day there?
No. Because if I remember correctly,
What's the Greek?
it is a present participle. Oh, internet, why are you so slow? I have to do this out a lot. Okay. Yeah, present participle. So what she's basically trying to communicate is not that it is a future event that she's looking forward to, but this is something that is a present and ongoing event. So it's that's what you have a present participle for. And you may ask, what on earth is a present participle? Well, you're going, you're running, you're breathing. This is the thing that you're doing at the present time, and it's an ongoing action. So she's confessing that Jesus Christ is having present and ongoing effects in the world. So God is not just hasn't just sent Jesus, which is a past finite action. So he's who sent you into the world, and now it's done. You are coming into the world by constantly affecting what the world is doing. So that's more the force of it. Yeah. So arguably, you could say that the present participle still holds up because Jesus still has present ongoing effects into the world. Grammar's fun. It's not. I was gonna stop there. But yeah, when we get to Jesus Christ, I am statement, I am the resurrection and the life, I'm probably going to be going off on that for a long time. So definitely not enough time to do it now, especially when we're already past time. So let's close here for today with a prayer. Dear Lord Jesus Christ, we thank and praise you for coming into the world and for giving us life and salvation through you by your word and sacraments. We thank you, O Lord, for these precious gifts through which you have given us and all others in the faith life itself. We ask you, O Lord, to be with those who departed from the faith, that you guard and protect them until the resurrection to come, that we might join with them and experience all the blessings of the paradise which you have promised. We ask you, O Lord, to be with us and all those who grieve the loss of saints and others, and well, all other forms of grief that we might have. Please be with us as we go through our lives here in this world, awaiting the resurrection to come, where we can quite concretely join with you and all others in the flesh. In your name, O Lord Jesus Christ, do we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Now go ye therefore and eat lunch.